Hey, what's up with you guys? Hey, welcome back to another video. Now this is gonna be I got a lot of good feedback and positive reactions to the Moonkin Tanking guide that I posted. I didn't go into too many specifics regarding gear or talents or things like that, so I wanted to kind of go through that now. Basically, the idea from that, like I had mentioned, was watching Cargo's stream, and I was in this PvP spec that had some feral talents, so I figured it'd be worth a shot. So that was kind of what sparked that idea. There is a more optimized talent build I would go if I was focusing on Moonkin Tanking pretty consistently throughout dungeon content. And with that being said, there's definitely some pieces of gear that I don't have that would be more BIS. So what I'm going to do is every phase that releases, I'm going to post an updated best in slot specifically for Moonkin Tanking. I'm also going to be posting Moonkin DPS stuff as well, but I figure there's going to be very little, if any, content regarding Moonkin Tanking stuff. And hopefully you guys saw by that last video that it is definitely feasible in 5-mans. I definitely think I can make it work in 10-mans, assuming I have the right kind of gear for it. So with that being said, I wanted to go through some specific pieces and elaborate on some things that are very strong, some alternatives and things like that to give you guys some options, and maybe point out a couple things that you guys didn't think of, or point out some stuff that is very, very good. So with that being said, let's get right into it. First off with the gear. Now, this is what I have up open here is Atlas Loot. It's like a wish list type simulator thing that you can do. And so what I have here basically for the 8 pieces of body armor is I have tier gear. This is going to be optimized like this. Yeah. So I have 8. It's showing only I have 2 sets on because that's what my character currently has equipped. But you have the tier 1 helm, shoulders, chest, bracers, gloves, belt, legs, boots. Now I have this set up as your BIS because in phase 1, realistically, it probably is slot by slot the best stuff that you can get. When it comes to itemization, you're trying to focus on armor, stamina, and intellect, and then whatever spell damage you can get on top of that is a bonus. Ideally, you want the spell damage obviously for your threat output, but having a bunch of intellect so that you have the ability to cast and shift if you need to, things like that is very valuable. The stamina, obviously you're tanking, and the armor, obviously, especially as it scales into Moonkin form, has a significant value for tanking. So those are really those, just straight up stam, int, and armor gear, leather gear is really the priority. So with that being said, that's a huge chunk of your armor. That's half of your armor slots basically out the way if you can get your full tier 1, which if you're raiding at all should be really easy because there's usually not many druids in the raids. I know like our feral druid has 6 pieces of tier 1 and he hasn't rolled main spec on it once. So with that being said, I don't think it'll be too difficult for a lot of you guys if you're raiding to get full tier 1. So that is going to be your BIS. But let's go ahead and we'll start with some alternatives. Not really any alternatives in the helm slot, unfortunately. It's just far above anything else. All the other kind of caster helms are either cloth or engineering, which is also cloth and has like virtually no stats. You could use your tier 2 helm if for some reason you've gotten tier 2 before tier 1 off of Ani. The tier 2 helm is a great alternative, has decent tanky stats. Tier 1 actually has more stamina, slightly less armor, but it has spell damage instead of bonus healing. So I prefer the tier 1 helm by far. So that's going to be your best, but you could potentially run tier 2 if for some reason you've gotten that and not tier 1. Now, on to the neck piece. Your best is going to be Choker the Firelord just because it has so much spell damage on it. It will increase your damage output significantly. However, I don't have this right now, so I'm not using this at all. A couple other options we have here is Choker of Enlightenment, which is slightly worse in my opinion, just because the fact that it has double the damage for a couple less stamina is not at all even comparable in my opinion. But you can Choker of Enlightenment, it's also a great option. And you can also use the PvP neck if you want something that's just straight up tankier, the Sergeant's Insignia. And then I also have what I'm currently using, oh, I forget that this is off the screen, is the Star of Mystaria, which is off the last boss of Strat Live. All of those are decent options. This has some stam, int, and spirit on it, but the spell hit is great just for the consistency of your threat output. And just being able to land abilities. Obviously, if you get a string of misses, it's going to be very problematic, especially if it's in the opener. So this definitely shouldn't be considered to be bad or shitty by any means. In a lot of situations, I could see using this depending what groups I'm running. But yeah, those are all the options that I could kind of think of that would be decent, but I would say Choker of the Fire Lord would be your BIS, as well as your BIS for just straight up DPSing as a Moonkin. Shoulders, like I had said, is the tier gear, and then there's also an honorable mention, which is the Cyclone Spalders from Dire Maul North Tribute. They're also leather. They have stam and intellect and spell damage on them. So a lot of times I will actually run with these instead of the tier shoulders, because you can see it's basically 2 stamina difference. But these obviously have a little bit less armor but more damage, so depending on what you need, you can kind of tailor it to. This is a little bit more offensive, this is a little bit more defensive, just with the armor. So anyway, and a little bit more stamina. Now on to the cloak. There's really only 2 options here, and one of them is very easy to get, the other one's very hard to get. So I would suggest either the Saffron Drape if you can get it off Onyxia. That's what I'm using. It just has a good amount of damage and just a good amount of raw stats on it in general. And it has some resistance, which is negligible and could be good, but nothing really super exciting there. But just the massive amount of intellect you get and 14 damage and 10 stamina is just very solid. The alternative I would use though is Sergeant's Cloak, because it has a lot of stamina on it and it has a lot of armor for that back slot item. It is a very defensive choice, but a lot of the other cloaks outside of Saffron Drape don't have enough offensive stats to justify not gaining all of those defensive stats. And the fact that that armor scales into Moonkin form, this is actually a really significant pickup for your overall tankiness and the actual armor that you can get as far as like your actual armor throughout the entirety of the dungeon. So if you can't get Saffron Drape, I definitely suggest trying to get Sergeant's Cloak. It's not very hard to get. You just do have to do very little PvP. So this is by far our best option, just specifically because of that armor scaling that we have in Moonkin form. Now onto the chest. Really your only option is the tier chest. I'm trying to think. I know in Dire Maul West, here, I'll move this over to the middle of the screen. I know in Dire Maul West there's a leather chest piece, but I want to say it has very, very little stamina on it. 10 stamina. So you could use this as well. I haven't gotten this yet. This is not dropped for me, so I don't have the luxury of using this item. But this is another alternative if you're running a lot of Dire Maul West. Haven't tanked Dire Maul West yet personally, so I don't know how difficult that would be to tank. But this would be the only other leather chest I can think of, literally of all the dungeons, that would be somewhat decent. So if you can't get tier 1 and you're farming 5-mans, go ahead and try and get this out of Dire Maul West. Now on to the bracers. Really your tier 1 bracers are really easy to get, especially because they're BOE. So very worst case, you can get them off the auction house. Another alternative would be the PvP bracers having 17 stamina on them. I do think that the Cenarian bracers are significantly better because they have 13 stamina, which is still a lot, and it has the 6 spell damage on it. Also is part of your tier, so if you're at a breaking point with any of your tier pieces and things like that, yeah. And so I prefer the tier bracers, but these are also a decent option. You can get the 9 stamina on them if you want, if you're trying to be a little tankier, or you can get the 7 int if you're trying to get a bigger mana pool. Either way. On to the gloves. Tier 1 gloves. I know there's some alternatives, but I want to say they're like level 49 blues. They're nothing major to talk about. Ideally, you get these because these are really the only leather caster gloves that are available that I wasn't able to think of or find anything else. So I would really say your tier 1 is your kind of go-to here. I can't remember the name of those other gloves. They're out of BRD, I think BRD. That are like some leather gloves with 10 spell damage and 10 stamina on them or whatever. But these are definitely better, have a lot more armor and just more raw stats overall. So onto the belt. We have the tier belt, which obviously is BOE. You can get off the auction house. Another option I would mention is, I know I've emphasized the fact that you want to have high armor and leather gear if you can, but Banthok Sash is very good. It has spell damage and it has that 1% spell hit. So if there is going to be a single slot that you take an armor hit on, your belt provides less armor per slot than a lot of the other slots available. So it's a very low overall like flat armor value that you're losing. So if you're going to take a hit on armor anywhere, it would be in your belt slot, in my opinion. So you can see here it's 113 to 43. So what is that? 60, 70 armor difference. It's not super massive. So Anyway, that's the alternative, and it still has 10 stamina on it. Our tier belt has 10 stamina on it, so you're not going to feel significantly less tanky by rocking this belt, and you gain that spell hit. So if you're trying to go for a higher threat output, this is going to be a better option, but just be aware of it will make you a little bit less tanky in regards to your armor. On to the legs. We have our tier legs. There are, I want to say it's like the Luminaire Kilt, which is a leather caster legs that I think are at a lower Blackrock or BRD, but I don't really like them because they don't have very much stamina. They have a lot of intellect, but I want to say they have like 8 stamina or 10 stamina. So I would definitely try and get these Cenarian leggings also because they have MP5. So even if you don't have the reflection talent, you are going to gain value while in combat on your regen from these, as well as the spell crit. The spell crit is a big one. I found that spell crit is really massive for Moonkin Tanking just because the likelihood of you getting a crit on your first 3 casts in the opener on pulls really helps you get a jump in your threat lead right off the bat. So anywhere you can get crit easily and not sacrifice other stats is a really big one. So that would be my go-to, would be the tier legs here. Onto the boots, we have the tier boots, or the option I would say that's the only really viable alternative would be boots of the Shrieker. These are the only other leather boots that are high-ish in level and have stamina on them. There's the caster kind of DPS ones. I have them somewhere here. Oh, I think I have them on. These ones, water sprout boots, but they have 0 stamina on them and they have a little bit less armor. So again, really the fact that we don't get bonus stamina like we do in bear form, you really want to make sure you have stamina on every piece of gear you can. Having no stamina on a piece of gear is going to be noticeable, especially if you have it in more than one slot. So anyway, that's what I would choose. On to the rings. Now the rings, trinkets, and weapons is where you have really a lot of flexibility. The rings, there's a bunch of options, right? You can either go for just raw stats to give you as much stamina. You can go armor rings to try and be as defensive against that physical damage, or you can use spell damage rings and try and be as offensive as possible. So you really have the flexibility here to kind of tailor your build. So if you're lacking in armor on your other pieces over here, you can prioritize armor rings and more DPS focused gear, or vice versa. So the trinkets and the rings give you a lot of flexibility to make up for whatever stats you're lacking in your other armor pieces that you have available to you. So maybe unfortunately you don't have this and you have, a cloth caster DPS piece for your chest and you have cloth shoulders. It's not the end of the world. You're going to have a little bit less armor, but it's not that big of a deal at the end of the day, especially if you can make up for it by stacking a couple armor rings and basically counterbalancing that armor differential that you need. Now, we have the Heavy Dark Iron Ring out of Molten Core and the Dragon Slayer Signet, which is from turning the head in from Onyxia. This is the setup that I personally run and I think is going to be the best, with 2 exceptions that I still don't know if I would use these all the time in lieu of this option right here. I really like this option, but the Hand of Sulfuras is really decent, giving you just a ton of raw stats. I could see using this in exchange for the Dragon Slayer Signet, but it would still kind of be like a side grade. It would not be this massive upgrade to me, in my opinion, just based off of playstyle and how much I value crit. Obviously this has more int, so you are going to get a little bit more crit than int comparison wise to the Dragon Slayer Signet, but it's not going to be another percent. It's like another 0.2% crit, on this or something. So, but this has some value. The other thing to mention is the Ring of Spell Power is very strong. The fact that that's 33 damage to spells is massive. So I could see if I got this, maybe honestly swapping out the Dragon Slayer Signet and keeping the Heavy Dark Iron Ring as my defensive, and basically this is like my offensive ring. But either way, you have the flexibility and you can change it between dungeons and stuff like that, depending on, more melee heavy mobs versus casters, things like that. But those are the other 2 that are really viable that I don't have. You can see these green check marks mean I have the items or not. A couple of honorable mentions regarding blue items that are a little bit easier to obtain. We have Thrall's Resolve, which has some strength on it, which isn't ideal, but this is a quest reward. I think there's a similar quest for Alliance, for you Alliance players out there. But this has 150 armor, so it's actually more armor than the Dark Iron Ring, and it has 7 stamina on it. So this is a really good alternative if you're trying to make up armor. A similar scenario is the Ring of Protection. Again, I think there's a Alliance alternative to this, but I don't know that for sure. But this has 150 armor and 9 stamina. So this is a little bit better in my opinion because we don't gain a ton of value from the strength. Even if we switch into bear form, I would prefer to have that extra couple stamina for the entirety of the dungeon rather than that situational strength, right? We also have the Cyclopean band, which is a more offensive scenario. So like for me right now, if I wanted something a little more offensive, I would swap out the heavy dark iron ring and I would use the Cyclopean band. This is decent, pretty easy to get. It's out of arena runs in BRD, so there's always groups running this. So that's another alternative. On to the fun part here, the trinkets. Now, we have a lot of fun options with trinkets. At the very beginning of Classic, when I leveled this character up, I went enchanting and got Smoking Heart of the Mountain, and then dropped enchanting, and then leveled up engineering. So that's a little try hard. I don't expect everyone to do that, but because of that, I have this trinket, and then I also took the Mark of Tyranny as a quest reward with the idea that there's a lot of caster trinkets available later in the game and very few armor trinkets. So it is hurting me currently right now in this content because my second trinket that I'm using for my DPS gear is the Mind Tap Talisman, which is the MP5 trinket. So I gain no DPS from it at all. And the longevity of having that trinket is kind of irrelevant in current content. So I am taking a hit for it. You do have to sacrifice because I think you get that, whatever the trinket is, it's like 2% spell crit is the alternative for the reward from this. But it gives me the option. I could be stacking both of these trinkets if I needed to for very defensive situations. Again, like our ring slots, you have a lot of flexibility with your trinkets to be either very offensive or defensive, even in between pulls, depending on what kind of pulls you're doing, or again, between dungeons, things like that. But having 2 armor trinkets as a druid, being able to use Moonkin and bear form that utilize that armor so substantially is really, really huge. So if you have the ability and you're try hard enough to really go for Smoking Heart of the Mountain and you're willing to make that sacrifice for Mark of Tyranny, I do recommend doing it in the long run. Again, it is going to hurt you and be kind of a pain in the ass right now, but it will be worth it later due to the fact that there's so many other options as we get into later phases of the game. Now, Briarwood Reed and Mark of Tyranny are my 2 default trinkets that I run. I basically have a defensive option and an offensive option, so it's kind of like a good mix between the two. In a perfect world, what I would have instead of Briarwood Reed is I would have the Talisman of ephemeral power, right? From the trinket from Molten Core. That's what we're going to call it, the trinket from Molten Core. And the reason that I think this is so good is it's a very short cooldown, and you can use this in your opener, again, creating a really massive threat lead on the beginning of the pull, and you can basically get your opener off and then tab Moonfire these various targets with the increased spell power. So it's a very, very good trinket for this setup because so much of our threat and our burst is focused in the initial 10-15 seconds of the pull. So to me, this has more valuable than Briarwood Reed by a very significant margin, but I just haven't gotten this yet. So another alternative that's worth mentioning is the Essence of Pure Flame, which is off of Ragnaros. This is obviously kind of like a different variation of Thorns, but if you're running, improved Thorns and you're pulling these big packs, which might be good for some kind of AoE farm content, is definitely an option. This is a really good kind of higher DPS alternative. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is if you're fighting a lot of mobs, the scaling of bonus spell damage on Hurricane is not very good. The way that it does, I've noticed like I'll put like 2 or 3 more like higher spell damage items and it'll increase each tick of Hurricane by 1. So unless you're doing these massive pulls, you don't gain very much value from bonus spell damage via the scaling it has with Hurricane. I don't know exactly the math on how it scales with Hurricane. I just know that it's not very good. So for that reason, if I was for some reason doing these big massive pulls, maybe like Strat Undead or Strat Live would be a good example when you have those big undead packs and there's 7, 8, 9 mobs. Something like this is going to give you a lot of value on the reflective damage side of it, more so than the raw spell damage will and the scaling that it has with Hurricane. So just something to mention. A lot of times people don't give a shit about this trinket and they pass on it. No one really cares. I don't know if you'll be able to convince your guild or who you're running with to give it to you for Moonkin Tanking. I don't know how that will go, but just keep in mind this is something you actually can get a lot of value out of if you're Moonkin Tanking in dungeons. Another kind of honorable mention is Goblin Mortar if you're engineering, or any of those there's another one that's like the little bombs that like run on the ground that blow up, things like that you can use to help initiate threat here in the beginning, because you can also use grenades while in Moonkin form. So engineering is a really good addition to Moonkin Tanking in general, because it allows you a lot of alternative ways of getting threat. And Goblin Mortar is one of those. Goblin Mortar does a ton of damage, and it's a larger radius than the grenades are. So this is definitely very good if you're doing any kind of AoE pulls. Just a lot of threat off of this. I talked about those two. There's also the Prism Charm, which I think this was a quest from Mara, or so. I don't even remember where this is from. You guys can look it up. But this is all related to all your magic resistances. So if there's some kind of like special spell damage mitigation that you're really lacking for some specific situation, I just wanted to throw that in there, that this is like a magic damage mitigating trinket you could rock. Ramstein's Lightning Bolts. This is an amazing trinket for AoE, honestly. This is a really underrated trinket. I remember this has dropped a couple times and everyone's like, oh, that thing sucks. And I'm really surprised our tanks didn't like insist on getting it, because the way that this damage works is it's like an immediate burst to every target around you. It doesn't have a cap. So on larger AoE pulls, it is huge for gating that initial threat to give you those, like for us, for example, you have to cast Bark Skin and then cast Hurricane. So you need 2 globals, which is 3 seconds to initiate the damage on your AoE. And it still takes a couple seconds after that for there to be enough damage out to where you really have threat, right? So this is a really good trinket for us specifically on our synergy, because we need a little bit of ramp up time. After the first few seconds, we have really good threat because we're dishing out so much damage to every target around us. But this is a really good tool to use. You can run in basically Bark Skin and pop this at the same time, and then also then do your Hurricane right after it, and it basically will dish out enough initial burst to everyone to keep them near you until Hurricane starts actually getting its damage out. And then obviously we have Rune of the Dawn if you're running any of the Strat and Skolo stuff. This is a really great trinket. It's 48 spell power, so this is a good one, obviously. Just wanted to kind of mention that. On to the weapons. This is my, this offhand, I would want this. This is my ideal setup. I would want Aura Stone Hammer with 30 spell power on it, and I would want Therazane's Touch. I only have this offhand from AV. If you guys haven't gotten the offhands from AV, I definitely suggest you do that, because they are very strong for a very long time. And they're really easy to get. A little bit harder now because of the queue times, at least for us on Horde side on Herod. It's like 30-minute queues, which is rough. But this is very good. Very, very, very good offhand based off of the content and stuff available to us in phase 2.5. Aura Stone Hammer has some stamina and some intellect and some MP5, and it all has that 25 spell damage. Get the 30 spell power on top of that. This is just a really good offensive setup. So you can really use these 2 pieces to be like your main offensive. And then you have a lot of flexibility, like I mentioned, between your rings and trinkets to get much more defensive. So that would be kind of my suggestion, my ideal setup. Some alternatives and some honorable mentions when it comes to the weapons is we have Finkel's Lava Dredger. You could rock this and put 30 spell damage on it if you wanted to. It just has a lot of raw stats on it. It's just a really good weapon. It's really good for PvP, honestly. And the fact that it has 15 fire resistance on it isn't something to balk at either. As you get into Molten Core content and BWL, that fire resistance is really relevant and important. So not something to totally balk at here. So that's worth mentioning. The Unyielding Maul, which is out of Dire Maul North Tribute. I mentioned this in my Moonkin PvP guide as an alternative to a really tanky weapon you can rock. If for some reason you don't have a good caster weapon, this is an okay weapon. It has 12 stamina, which is a pretty significant amount compared to any of the blues that you would get in the dungeons. A lot of them either have no stamina or very little stamina as far as like one-handers and things like that. And it also has 250 armor and 8 defense. The 250 armor is really massive. It scales insanely with Moonkin form. So maybe you have all offensive rings and trinkets and you're rocking like an Unyielding Maul as your weapon. You have the flexibility between all these slots to really play with that. Just wanted to mention that it's very strong. Staff of Dominance I have in here as well. This is obviously kind of a go-to. Most people are really aiming for this if they can get it, but this is obviously a good option if you can get it. As well as Sorcerer's Dagger is actually not that bad. Now, initially at first glance, I was like, oh, this thing sucks. If you really look at it, you're basically trading 7 intellect and 5 spell damage. You're trading 7. So this has basically 7 less intellect. It has the MP5 and it has a little bit more spell damage. Aura Stone Hammer is better, but this still has basically 5 less spell damage and no MP5, but it has 7 more intellect. So arguably it's got a little bit more crit, which that would be about like 0.13% more crit, right? Nothing massive, but worth mentioning. More instant, so it's going to give you a bigger mana pool in general, and the damage is going to be negligible. So not to say that it's better than this, because it's not, or Stonehammer is better, but this is a decent alternative. And if you're really trying to meme hard, you can do what I've done and run something like the Time Worn Mace, which is out of Dire Maul West, and enchant it with 30 spell power. This is not a bad alternative if you can't get your hands on any of these other options, because it does have the armor and it does have stamina on it, and it's a one-hander. So it allows you the flexibility of the offhander, either to use an offhander with stamina or something with spell power. It gives you that flexibility, whereas you can't really do that the same way with the two-handers. So that's kind of all the options I could think of. Hopefully that helps you guys when it comes to the gear. Let's really quickly talk on what the optimal talent setup would be, which I kind of put this together here. Is that showing right? Yeah. So this is what I would be running if I was specifically trying to only Moonkin tank. Now, we have 5 points here in Improved Wrath because Nature's Grasp is useless for dungeons. I don't have Natural Shapeshifter because the vast majority of the time you are in Moonkin form only. And if you shift into bear form, rarely, in what I've been able to test so far, is it worthwhile to shift back out of bear form. So usually you're talking about one shift over the course of the entirety of a pull, and that 3 points is not really a good value of the 3 points when you can put it in something like Improved Thorns that you're going to have and gain value of for the entirety of every pull in every dungeon that you run. And not to mention, you also are going to be ideally using the tier 1 set, and you'll have the 3 set bonus on top of Improved Thorns. So this is just really good synergy with our ideal, itemization that we're trying to aim for. Nature's Reach is really helpful because being able to pull at max range gives you a little bit of time to get one more spell cast in. Whereas if you didn't have this, the target's going to connect with you when you cast your second Wrath. You're going to cast your first Wrath and then Starfire, Moonfire. When you cast that second Wrath, they'll already be in your face. So this extra range, assuming you can pull from max range, has a lot of value. Rest of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. On to the Feral Tree. You can see here I don't have Improved Bash. We don't use Pounce at all, obviously, with this setup. And Bash I do use, but not enough to justify how often I gain value from it over just having increased armor in general, right? So that's why I ran 5 points here into Thick Hide. Someone had asked me in the video that I posted if Feral Charge was worth it, and after messing with this, 100% Feral Charge is worth it. And I'll tell you why, because you're basically deciding between Feral Charge or Insect Swarm, right? That's really the options that you have at hand here. Feral Charge, very consistently, there's a lot of bosses or mobs that have some kind of a stun or an aggro drop mechanic. Very, very regularly when that happens, you are not going to have the ability to be right next to the mob as it runs to your healer or DPS, whoever rips aggro, right? So very commonly, I'm switching into bear and then Feral Charging and then taunting that target after that stun wears off, or I land from the knockback or whatever it is. Feral Charge is very important because otherwise we don't have any way of gaining mobility to get to the target, and that extra 2 or 3 seconds it would take can be detrimental in certain situations. So this is very, very valuable, specifically as it relates to tanking situations. Over to the Resto Tree. Fur is pretty self-explanatory. And then down this, assume you went into the Resto Tree and you wanted to run Insect Swarm. I know Cargo's on stream, they were talking about this for a while, and the reason I think Insect Swarm is terrible if you're taking Moonkin form, because if you are going to justify using this, 1, as a global cooldown, and 2, from mana cost to damage ratio, you need to also account for a second global cooldown and the mana cost of Moonkin form. When you factor those 2 things in, Insect Swarm is not worth it, especially because it only lasts for 12 seconds. So your uptime on the course of a fight is going to be negligible, and you won't be able to cast it outside of the initial portion of the pull, in which case, in my opinion, you never want to be using that 1.5 seconds of time during the pull when you can be free casting on a global cooldown to cast something like Insect Swarm and then back into Moonkin form. It's just absolutely not worth it, and no way that I can come up with any math to justify that, why that would be better. I don't think it is. And if you're talking about trading that for something like Feral Charge, giving you that mobility and that utility in those oh shit moments to, really get back to help your teammate or peel off your healer or whatever, this is significantly more valuable when it comes to tanking specifically. I think that's it, everyone. Hopefully I covered all the topics and helped you guys with some ideas of different gear and things like that that you can use. If any of you are really trying to go hard into the Moonkin tanking idea, by all means, I think this honestly is going to be the go-to talent build. I will update and post new videos relating to new content in the raids and kind of like new BIS lists as new content comes out. So again, thanks so much you guys for watching this. If you made it this far, please comment, rate, subscribe, all that fun stuff. If you guys are enjoying the content, let me know. If there's stuff you don't like, stuff that's boring, also let me know so I can make stuff that is enjoyable for you guys. With that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.